On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, with China and the U.S. absent in the room, will talk of WTO reforms go anywhere?
The United States will withdraw.
The United States will withdraw.
And the U.S. bows out of long-standing treaties. What's next for everybody else? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. A two-day ministerial meeting on the WTO reforms is being held in the Canadian capital of Ottawa, hosted by Canada officials from the European Union, and several developing and developed economies are discussing reforms to the organization in light of world trade tensions. China and the United States, two of the world's largest economies, are not invited. Before we start our discussion about the future of WTO and what it means with this talk, let's take a look at this.
The WTO finds itself at a crossroads. The ministerial gathering in Ottawa on WTO reforms has much to do with rising unilateralism and increasing trade tariffs. The European Union, Australia, Japan, Singapore, and South Korea are expected to attend. Brazil, Chile, Kenya, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, and Switzerland are also invited to the October 24 and 25 meeting. The WTO is supposed to be the international organization with a mission to encourage open trade and to reduce barriers. However, it's having a hard time living up to its purpose, with globalization facing unprecedented challenges. Some member states are apparently fed up, questioning the value and current framework of the WTO. That's why they're putting together a proposal for reforms. At the top of the meeting's agenda are efforts to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the WTO and how to reinvigorate its negotiating function. Without the participation of China and the U.S., many worry that the Canadian-hosted meeting would be pointless. In the past few months, U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to quit the WTO unless it adopts rules more favorable to the U.S. Since becoming a full member of the WTO in 2001, China has pursued a policy of defending the organization and its values. China is also an active advocate of a multilateral trading system. Many are curious whether the original WTO framework will eventually be shaken down. After all, the WTO framework hasn't changed much since its inception in 1995, and thorough reforms seem to be the logical next step.
For more on the discussion of the WTO, I'm joined here in Beijing by Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. And we're hoping also joining us later, our panelists from different parts of the world. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Liu, about the fact that the talk is going on without the United States and China. Obviously, Canada is trying to be the middleman, but will that be able to bear any fruit?
I think it's a reflection of a general desire that that can really achieve a consensus that the whole world does need a multilateral trading platform, and every country have benefited. And the other consensus is that, okay, WTO does require reform. But your question is that whether Canada can really take the leadership in the absence of the two biggest economies. So that's quite a question. But it sends also a very strong signal that given the U.S. action, and so the whole world need to really work out a solution to safeguard this trading system.
Right. And joining us in Calgary from Canada, Carlo Dade, who is the director of the Center on Trade and Investment Policies from the Canada West Foundation. Welcome, sir. Also joining us from Bern, we have Nicholas Imboden, who is the partner and co-founder of Ideas Center Geneva. I want to welcome you as well. Let me ask you, Mr. Dade, I understand you have to leave earlier, but let me ask you about that. The Canadian Minister of International Trade and Diversification, Mr. Jim Carr, obviously is quite enthusiastic about the proposal. What do you think could be the fate of the 3-point proposal that Canada has been making this time?
Well, in regards to Canada's role here, it's important to note that I don't think, as your previous guest noted, that Canada, even in combination with the middle powers, can solve this issue, can bring about WTO reform on its own. It's going to require a multitude of efforts by different parties. China is working on one with Japan and the US. The EU has one. So this is part of that larger array of efforts that are going out. I think that Canada's role can be to get a group of countries, these middle powers, and expanding out to similar countries of similar size and similar economic weight, to bring their consensus to bear on the issues and to put forward potential solutions. Some of what comes out of the meeting today and later work will feed into the larger contribution to solving some of these issues.
All right.
So it's not surprising that Canada would step up to play this role, as other countries have.
One thing is about Canada playing the role. The other thing is what exactly is the role that Canada is playing and what kind of proposal is Canada putting forward. In Edmonton, we have Wenran Jiang, a senior fellow at the Institute for Asia Research of the School of Public Policy, University of British Columbia. He's also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Professor Jiang, wonderful to see you here on the big screen here in our Beijing studio. Your thoughts about the proposal made by the Canadian side? Obviously, there's one about dispute settlement. There's one about obligations of the developing economies. There's also one about how to deal with some of the current crises the WTO is facing right now. But the question is, will these three proposals be able to go the middle way that parties could accept? Professor.
Well, this is I guess the Canadian position now, proactive as it is really a choice among no other good choices. Canada, frankly, just been pretty bruised by a negotiation of a North American Free Trade Agreement 2.0, but there's no free trade word in it. It's a managed trade called USMCA. The Americans literally bullied Canada and Mexico with all the deadlines, demands, even public humiliation to Canadian Prime Minister and his delegation of negotiators. So Canada very concerned, squeezed between American largest trading partner and China, which is going second trading partner, and which has a trade war going on with the United States. Canada's option now as a middle power, as the previous panelist mentioned, no choice but move forward with some moderate proposals just to keep things not falling apart. I don't know if it can rescue anything or make things better, but at least to keep momentum, saying this is WTO, we're still committed to multi-international mechanisms. You know, there's nationalist versus globalist going on between Trump and else, and that's where Canada stands now.
Right. Mr. Dade, now, we understand that Canada wants to play an important role in bringing out proposals, and yet, Mr. Dade, we also understand that Canada seems to be, in its proposal this time, addressing every issue that the Trump administration has raised about WTO. And people wonder whether Canada is being, in a way, just a power in the shadow of the United States, or actually Canada is coming in trying to be an even hand or a constructive negotiator, bringing all parties together.
Appearances with this type of initiative are, as you've noted, extremely important. As Wenran noted too, Canada has just gone through a bruising series of negotiations with the Americans for the North American Trade Agreement. Now, because I would note that our initiative with the WTO, though, started well before the negotiations with the Americans were concluded, well before the Americans put in the clause about non-market economies. So this has been an ongoing concern in Canada. Someone is going to have to deal with the U.S. issues. I would agree that it's a mistake to take everything the U.S. has said seriously, but if anyone knows that, if any country has experience with that, if any country has experience with how to deal with U.S. bullying, it's Canada, and bringing that knowledge into the context of dealing with the WTO will be critical. I think that not every group that's working on WTO reform is going to touch on all the American issues that Canada is bringing forward. Is, again, just a reflection that you have several parties dealing with a very complex and multifaceted issue.
Mr. Day, the very interesting characteristics that you have been suggesting about where Canada is and how would Canada share with the other economies around the world. Carol Day, thank you so much for joining us. Let me go to Mr. Imboden. You've been hearing, Mr. Imboden, from your colleagues from Canada talking about their ideas and their understanding of what's going on. Well, there's one thing that is going on right now is the United States being what they consider as so-called disruptive, constructive party in the overall trade system. But obviously, the other economies do not look at it that way. With Canada and the EU trying to bring everybody together for the next steps of negotiation, will the United States, though, be cooperative? That's always a question, particularly if it is all about U.S.-centered. Mr. Imboden.
Yes, good evening. I'm very glad to be able on this to be on this panel. First, let me tell you,
if you look at the camera, it will be even better, Mr. Imboden. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for being on the panel. Let me first say that I am an old man, has been. I don't represent anybody. I'm just allowed to say the crude reality, the way I see it.
All right.
So don't misunderstand me. I'm not against the US, I'm not against China, I'm not against the EU. I love them all. But what I'm interested is in a functioning multilateral trading system. And the multilateral trading system is not functioning. What I believe is that all the issues that President Trump has been putting on the table, they have been on the table since 5 years or 10 years. We have been discussing this issue all the time in WTO, but we have not really advanced. The difference between Trump and the former administration is that Trump now is bullying it. He's saying either you have a solution or I do it bilaterally because I have more power bilaterally. And that's true. He has more power bilaterally than with 165 countries. So I think we need to show Mr. Trump that the way to go ahead is not bilaterally, by not giving in to his bullying, and asking to try to find solutions within WTO at the multilateral level.
Well,
and that's a challenge for the EU and for China.
Mr. Imboden, very interestingly, you put it that way, that on the one hand, not to kowtowing to the bullying of the Trump administration, in your words, but at the same time be able to provide satisfying answers to all his questions. That seems to be quite an interesting balance anyone could take and keep. Mr. Imboden, could you elaborate on what exactly you meant?
Well, what I mean is, you know, as you have seen, I mean, as it has shown, and actually Mr. Leitchinger has said it very openly in his statements in the U.S., is that the U.S. tries to get bilateral deals not because it doesn't believe in the multilateral system, but because it believes it can get a better deal. And he has gotten a better deal. Look what he has done with Canada. Instead of negotiating with Mexico and Canada together on the NAFTA, he decided to first have an agreement with Mexico, where bilaterally he can put all the pressure possible, and then force Canada more or less to participate in it.
Mr. Imboden.
Well, he's right in his policy.
Mr. Imboden, I think we have enough analysis about the approach of Trump. But the question is, when you have the United States, which is the largest economy in the world, threatened to withdraw from the international system, will the others all be threatened to the heart that they have to provide all the satisfying answer in the American eyes about what to do? By the way, we don't want to forget that the other 164 economies of the WTO, they also have their own concerns. For example, the smaller economies, if they do not have a multilateral system, the smaller economies gonna be the weakest among all. They will have no negotiation and bargaining power. We all understand, including the country of Switzerland. So the question is, if the United States is doing that, what everybody else is doing, well, at the same time, how can bring back the United States with the discussion that is going on right now? That is the question, isn't it, Mr. Imboden? Very briefly from you before we go to the others.
No, but, quite frankly said, first of all, I want to say that what Trump is asking, many of the things, not all of them, but a lot of things, actually many other countries are requesting too. They are not alone. The others are just shutting up because Trump is taking the fire. But the EU has the same concerns, for instance, about China than the US. So what it is normal that each country comes into WTO with his own interests. The problem is that everybody has to move. Up to now, the US says, I'm not moving. Either I get what I ask or I'm out.
Okay.
But I haven't seen any of the other countries
Got
moving
it.
either.
You explain your view very well.
So the response is not to block.
Yes, okay. With that in mind, and Mr. Imboden, after 3 pushes from me, did bring out the issue of China. Professor Liu, I have to go to you about that. So eventually, all these so-called negotiations and discussions about the future of WTO, will it become a discussion from your perspective about bringing China to very much the demands of everybody? Will they become one direction discussion, Professor Liu?
I think that's a very important question. China is very concerned about.
Professor Liu.
I think that's a very...
Right now, the WTO reform has been in the air for so many years and without substantial improvement. If the world attention or the fingers are really pointed to China, that's going to be a disastrous effect because that's going to deviate from the entire reform objective. And of course, China has a lot of way to
What
improve.
is the reform objective from your perspective, Professor Liu?
Yes, the general principle is there, but they are targeting more on the transparency and fairness in removing government subsidies and also touching up on SOEs, etc. But China has this unique situation. But as long as they are able really to play with the hard rules of WTO, and also that China will honor its commitment. So I think that will be the right thing. And also China pays a great attention that that's going to be a differentiated treatment towards different level of development for different countries.
All right. Professor Jiang, your perspective, from a Canadian perspective, how do you see the future of direction of these negotiations? Will it be making Trump happy and making China suffer? Is that the goal?
Well, now we have a situation that the United States under President Trump no longer sees all these multi-international institutions, not only WTO but others as well, as not really serving the U.S. first principle as he proclaimed. Just 2 nights ago, he was giving a speech in Texas, basically said, I'm a nationalist, okay? Use that word, I'm a nationalist. So here we're having a multi-international institution that was literally set up, driven by Americans initially, are trying to withdraw and trying to renegotiate. I don't think the rest of the world has much choice. We cannot leave Americans out or the rest of the world coming together. EU alone, China alone, or several parties alone cannot really do the job with Americans, without Americans participating. So I think here's the deal. With the rise of nationalism and protectionism overall, how do you achieve compromise? I think that's where Canada, as a middle power, is putting together like-minded countries from different parts of the world, yet not including Americans and the Chinese, because the 2 parties are too controversial. I agree with Professor Liu that China, in the current trade tensions with the United States, needs to do more positive terms, not thinking about Americans are simply trying to contain China's rise, which there is this element. But U.S. policies are not always consistent. The next time Trump, if get re-elected, or another administration coming in, they may change the path as well. So therefore, China may think positively what China can do in the WTO framework to accelerate the kind of reforms that's good for Chinese consumers, that's good for the rest of the world, and then the rest of the world is seeing China by doing leadership, not by demanding or sticking to its point.
As we can see, the history of WTO starts when they replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. And it is a forum for discussion, institution body with a 7-man appellate court to settle a dispute. Having said that, though, one of the important issues about WTO right now is the appellate body, which is about dispute settlement. One of the most crucial functions of WTO is paralyzing because of the United States refusing to provide or have a goal with the judges coming into the appellate body. So that brings us, gentlemen, a very interesting question. That is, you have the current WTO mechanism being violated already on a constant basis and in clear terms by the current administration in the United States, and also by its reluctance to provide judges to the appellate body, so that WTO dispute settlement overall will have to collapse. Well, at the same time, you are asking for an international organization that in the future that's going to have the authority and credibility to decide on disputes and have the authority to speak out on behalf of most of the economies. That seems to be very contradictory with one another. People could say, well, you've already got the United States violating the WTO rules for years. Why would you ask us now, quote unquote, to follow the rules, whatever the rule is? Professor Zhang, about that point, are we having two phases of WTO right now, or the so-called negotiations right now?
Well, what we're seeing today now, as you just summarized, the Americans actually are suing everybody else over using WTO body at the same time blocking judges after their terms expire. And we have a situation, well, no international organizations are perfect. WTO is a dispute settlement mechanism. As limited as it is, it has settled successfully very complex, over 500 cases. Many cases still on the table. I think Americans should come to the realization that if you want to reform WTO, you cannot stop it from working. I think it's the best case scenario is everybody come together and saying, okay, the body is not perfect. There are things you want to reform. Same as a UN reform. You just can't withdraw from the crowd, as what they put it, from different bodies and saying we stop funding it, we withdraw it, and then what you create is a kind of situation that we have no. I think the common sense at some point will come back to the U.S. administration, which is the core of the Trump administration now. The cabinet is dominated by very hard-line negotiators. I think that is the problem at the moment.
All right, Mr. Imboden, very briefly from you, your thought regarding some of the previous points.
Yes, well, I have 2 points. One, to say that the U.S. is nationalist, Trump is nationalist. We are all nationalists when we negotiate. We negotiate for our countries. That's normal. Secondly, let's forget about Trump. Let's speak about the issues. Trump is just a way of how he is negotiating. I think we should test him. You know, we have been discussing about the dispute settlement since 10 years. There are reforms necessary. Let's move ahead and put something on the table that responds at least partially to legitimate concerns of the US administration. And let's see whether they actually will work out. I don't think they will. And if they do, why don't we make a plurilateral? And I don't think that the US will be wanted to be excluded from a plurilateral on dispute settlement that is important to them too.
All right. Well,
but I do think that China has a special role.
Okay.
Okay, I stop.
Yes, Mr. Imboden, we are running out of time. I will have Professor Liu, also from Beijing, to say a few words before we wrap it up. Professor Liu.
I think the position is utterly important at the moment. I think there can be two misconceptions for the position. One is really the 164 members are really negotiating and compromising with the demand of the United States. So this is not really reflecting the spirit of setting up WTO as a full member and consensus-driven. The other is that, the rest of the members would rally with the United States to negotiate and coerce China. So these are the two wrong directions that we have to warn. So therefore, how to defend the real spirit of WTO as a multilateral trading system for fair, transparent, taking into consideration of differentiations among different level of development of different sides of the countries. So that's the way that we need to go.
Well, we are asking for the interests of our own countries when we negotiate. However, whether that is being called a nationalist or not, I guess those are two different concepts. Meanwhile, the legitimate concerns, what could be considered as legitimate by one economy, while considered by the others might be differently. Certainly, these are all fascinating questions involved in a widespread negotiation process of the World Trade Organization. But for now, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for sharing your thoughts from your own perspectives. After all, discussion will lead us to some kinds of consensus, hopefully, in the future. Liu Baocheng, Wen Ranjiang, Nicholas Imboden. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The U.S. has bowed out of the several long-standing international treaties. What's next for everybody else? That discussion right after this break. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, globalization and a multilateral foreign policy have been at the back burner. So far, the U.S. has withdrawn from 8 deals it has signed, yet Mr. Trump, with his American First policy, is far from done. He has waged a tariff war with most trading partners, and security concerns are growing across the world as many sees it.
The United States will withdraw.
The United States will withdraw.
The United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
From the Iran nuclear deal.
From the Paris Climate Accord. We're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
Since Mr. Trump took office, he delivered on his campaign promises to pull the U.S. out of international deals he deemed unfair. In pursuit of the interest of the world's largest economy, he has decided to ditch long-standing commitments the U.S. has made with different partners. Some about trade, some about security. Most significantly, the U.S. has dropped the Global Compact on migrants and Paris Accord on climate change. By doing so, President Trump started the trend of anti-globalization, which encouraged nationalism and extremism around the world. A trade war between the world's largest economies has caused the growth of the global economy. And trade rules between the U.S. and its traditional allies have either been rewritten or renegotiated. When it comes to security, Russian President Vladimir Putin made an interesting metaphor.
As far as I remember, the coat of arms of the United States depicts a bald eagle. In one talon it holds 13 arrows, and in the other an olive branch as a sign of a peaceful policy with 13 olives on it. Has your eagle already picked all the olives, so only arrows are left?
With the midterm elections getting close, the world is waiting for the U.S. to give a clear answer.
For more on the ever-going China-U.S. trade war, joining us in Beijing, Liu Baocheng once again, Dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. In Washington, we are joined by Jeff Moon, International Trade and Government Affairs Consultant and former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for China. And in Chicago, we have Da-Li Yang, Professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome to three of you, gentlemen. Earlier, have you already noticed that we have a heated debate about the WTO reform and the interests of China, United States, everybody else in that 165 trade body. Things are more complicated than just the WTO, isn't it, Mr. Moon, that we see the Trump administration deciding on withdrawing from several international treaties and mechanisms. Will that process continue from your perspective?
Well, I suspect that it will. President Trump has said that he's not a globalist, that he does not believe in the multinational order, and so I suspect there will be more withdrawals. I'm not sure where, and I think, personally, I think that that's regrettable, but I think that process may continue.
That process may continue. Therefore, Professor Yang, everybody else has to adjust to that. After all, U.S. is the largest economy and one of the most influential countries in the world. But would that mean that everybody would have to sacrifice their interests to bring the U.S. back, even though whether that will bring the U.S. back or not is still a big question mark, Professor?
Well, certainly a lot is in the air, and certainly at the same time, there is a lot of talks among the different parties in seeking to strike new deals. And in fact, the Trump administration is not averse to new deals down the road, but it wants to actually stir the pot up quite a bit, certainly in this case, but in the hope also of getting something much better in the under the moniker of America First. So in that sense, actually, it's sort of this is truly a reset of the entire system.
Professor Liu, from your perspective, resetting the system, that's what Professor Yang just used, the phrase. Will everybody else in the international community also follow suit in a way that they would withdraw from things that they don't like 100% and only remain in the bodies that they would like and enjoy the most from? Therefore, you will see a international mechanism and systems being, in a way, very different from previous days.
So I think it's a matter, whether we are taking a short-term deal approach or take a long-range approach. So immediately, it seems that the Trump administration is using a bullish manner to coerce and corner some of the countries for the benefit of the United States. But, I would advise that more countries would really see a longer term and to weigh the pros and cons of managing a multilateral trading system. So, compromise could be one, but a principle is there to be defended for this spirit.
Mr. Moon, which is likely to be more relevant? A international mechanism without the United States participating, but yet the other parties on the mechanism are still, to a certain extent, enjoying themselves, or totally without these international mechanisms, or bringing the United States once again back to these international mechanisms. Well, many of those remain on the platform from the very beginning, feeling they have to sacrifice a big deal in order to do that, which is likely to be more relevant. And according to the hard rules of international politics, which is likely to happen from your perspective, Mr. Moon?
Well, certainly the world community acting in concert is the preferable option. And I think that's what's going to happen in the end. It is the sovereign right of every nation to participate or not to participate in an international agreement. And in a number of the cases that we're talking about here, I think that it's a matter of updating, not fundamentally changing a lot of these agreements that are quite old and perhaps over time need to be updated a bit. So I'm optimistic that the negotiations will continue. It's not a matter of sacrificing, it's a matter of reaching consensus so that there is a benefit for all countries and that these organizations and agreements are relevant to all countries.
Professor Yang, among the international mechanism, treaties, and agreements that the U.S. withdrawn so far, you see so many different categories. Some are related to the United Nations, for example, UNESCO and others, but that is out of a dispute about the Palestinian-Israeli issue. You also see those that are actually international agreement or things that people have been working on for years. For example, the Iran nuclear deal, which the U.S. Earlier administration was certainly a participant and also signatory to. You also see different kinds of withdrawal by the current administration. It's very hard to generalize that the current administration is trying to update the international system, but rather it's a mixture of interests that we have seen from the actions. Professor Yang, whether my judgment is right or not, I would like to have your views as well.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are so many different things happening at the same time.
That's right.
So therefore, it's very difficult to have a simple rule. It just appears that the administration is willing to go along on many issues. But in fact, in certain aspects, for example, in terms of the climate treaty, the U.S. continues to decrease the use of coal for power generation and so on. So even without actually formal participation in the climate treaty, the trend is already set. In certain other areas, however, change, especially, for example, in terms of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, is going to be destabilizing. And in fact, it may unleash new forces, and it would be very, very challenging to deal with it. But there are also interest in saying that actually that there are violations and so on, and of course it may be outdated in terms of the new circumstances. So a lot of changes that are happening, and in certain cases it may be justified. In other cases, it may be actually quite destabilizing.
And therefore, Mr. Moon, one question can be legitimately asked. With the frequent political changes and the wind blowing in very different directions in Washington, this administration's decision and tendency might be very different from the next administration. We don't know when the next administration will happen, though. At least 4 or 8 years, we don't know. But so whether do we know or not where U.S. stands is a big question mark for many of the other countries. You know, they agree to something that the current administration proposed, but the next one comes in, might be thinking very differently. Can we accept a 4-year change of the international system every time? That's also a question mark, Mr. Moon.
Well, this also gets into matters of U.S. law. In matters of where the Senate has confirmed a treaty, it is much harder to change the U.S. position. There are other agreements that were negotiated during the Obama administration that were not treaties, and so therefore the U.S. president can change his position. I take your point that American policy needs to be consistent. I do think that this particular administration has prided itself on taking a very hard look at commitments and rethinking them, but the ability to change those commitments, as I said, very much depends on whether we have a treaty obligation or not.
Professor Liu, of course, we all know the elephant in the room, as we say, that is the relations between China and the United States. We really need to mention here rising power, incumbent power, U.S. feeling now China could be even termed as, quote unquote, the enemy or the adversary because it's strategically growing, and to the extent that Washington even feel feared about. Professor Liu, therefore, all the changes that we're talking about here, from the U.S. demand, it is looking at its self-interest. China, well, looking at its own self-interest, but at the same time, it's a rising power and therefore has to go with the rest of the world, unlike what the current administration in the United States is doing. So, Professor Liu, how will China keep that balance and be willing to keep that balance, Professor?
I think there is a fundamental difference in terms of the attitude. China does recognize that we have benefited fairly from the multilateral trading system, while the Trump administration says that all the rest of the world is really taking unfair advantage of the generosity of the United States. So China is now resolved to its own reform towards more market-driven economy, and in the same time keep open further of its door, and also particularly over the Belt and Road Initiative, China is really spreading the benefits they have received and the prosperity they created to many of those underdeveloped economies. So that's the right approach, particularly during the difficult time when the world is losing direction in the value system. So I think China is really standing on the right foot.
Mr. Moon, we are facing a world now with the U.S. probably taking the lead and weakening everybody else about looking at each other's weak points, suggesting, oh, they're all doing for their own national interests. With that in mind, how will the world be able to come to any consensus? After all, will threat be able to do the job, or will consensus be able to do the job? That's, in fact, a very ultimate question, Mr. Moon, particularly coming from the biggest power in the world. From your perspective, sir.
Well, today, with respect to the multilateral trading system, today in Ottawa, there is a meeting of 10 or more nations to talk about WTO reform. And that does not include a U.S. representative or a Chinese representative. So that conversation is already proceeding. I would distinguish that from the bilateral conversation between the U.S. and China. And it's very important to recognize that with respect to the bilateral relationship, we are at a very important inflection point.
Right.
For the first 3 decades of reform and opening up, we had complementary economies. China had low-cost labor that could be used with American industrial capacity. Now China, in this most recent decade, is emerging as a competitor. And the problems in the relationship that were always buried in that complementary relationship are now the entire relationship. And so this friction, which has been there all along, has now really come to the fore and really needs to be resolved in a way that was not the case before.
Before we go, less than a minute, Professor Yang, that bilateral, well, multilateral, how do you see the proceedings or the process of the discussions with these 2 tracks in a way, Professor Yang?
Well, it's always difficult to balance them, but it's extraordinarily important for leaders to be committed to improving the system in terms of reaching out, in terms of thinking about the global good, rather than just nationally. Of course, every country has to mind its own interest, but at the same time, especially for countries such as China and the United States, they are so big. Generally, they need to take more of a global leadership position.
All right. Dali Yang, Jeff Moon, Liu Baocheng, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, on your website. And also, on behalf of the team, I'm Tian Wei here in Beijing. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.